Hello everyone, I'm Nitsahone, and it is limited review week on my channel. I covered every white card in Dominaria yesterday, and today we're looking at blue. If you want to know how I grade these cards, there's a link in the description below explaining what the grades mean. Now, let's get started. First up, we have Academy Drake, which for 2 generic into blue is a 2/2 Drake at common with flying, and it has Kicker. Kicker is an extra cost you can pay for a spell to get some kind of bonus, and in this case it's 4 generic mana, and if you pay that Kicker cost when you cast it, it enters a battlefield with 2+1/+1 counters. I'm always down to play Windrake in my blue decks. The 3 mana 2/2 flyer is usually about a C, but this one comes with some nice additional upside. Sure, it isn't super efficient as a 7 mana 4/4 flyer, but if you draw it in the late game and have a bunch of mana lying around, this isn't a bad way to spend it, and in the early game, it's also perfectly fine. That additional upside does enough to push this Windrake into the C+ range, I think. It will make the cut in most blue decks, but don't take it too early. Next, we have Academy Journey Mage, which for 4 generic into blue is a 3/2 human wizard at common, and it costs 1 less to cast if you control a wizard, and when it enters the battlefield, you return target creature an opponent controls to its owner's hand. So if you've watched my limited content before, you know that I love Mana Wars. That is, creatures who bounce another creature when they come into play. They are powerful because they build your board while setting your opponent's back, all with a single card. Even if your deck has 0 other wizards in it, playing a 5 mana 3/2 that bounces a creature isn't really a bad place to be. So this isn't the kind of wizard payoff that is just bad if you don't have other wizards. So I'm not going to give it a build-around grade. But if you do have other wizards, this does become better. This is good and the kind of card that is first pickable in some weaker packs, and that means it's a B-. Next, we have the Antiquities War, which for 3 generic and 1 blue is an enchantment saga at rare. Saga is a new card type introduced here, and it has chapters. When it enters the battlefield, you put a lore counter on it, and each lore counter, when you put it on it, gives you a new chapter. And the second and third lore counters go on after your draw step. So when you play it, you get 1 effect, and then on the next 2 turns, you get additional effects, and then it gets sacrificed. In this case, Chapter 1 and 2 are the same, and you get to look at the top 5 cards of your library, reveal an artifact from among them, and put them in your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. Also, artifacts you control become artifact creatures with base power and toughness 5/5 until end of turn. That's Chapter 3. So you can see that this is sort of trying to set itself up by drawing you a couple artifacts and then turning them into monsters. And this is a cool saga. It represents one of the more pivotal moments in Magic and Dominaria history. Obviously, though, this is a build-around. You can't really play this in a deck that doesn't have a decent number of artifacts, so it's basically an F if you don't have a lot of artifacts. You probably need about 7 for this to be at its best. I mean, Chapter 1 and 2 are going to hit things even if you have like 5, but Chapter 3 is not going to do much if you don't have like 3 or 4 artifacts in play. Sure, 2 artifacts in play is enough, I guess, probably, but you want a lot of them for this to be really impactful. And yeah, you have to hit an artifact on the first 2 chapters or it's going to be really bad for you. But it's like a B- in a deck that has a lot of artifacts. You know, 7+, 10's probably even better. There are a lot of artifacts in this format that are playable, and that's partly why, because there's an artifact sub-theme going on. And so it's not hard to build around this, but I wouldn't recommend first picking this, even though it has a pretty high ceiling, and that's because its floor is so terrible. It's basically unplayable in a deck where you don't get there on artifacts, so I would generally take like a lot of cards over it. That's why I've given it an F. Next, we have Arcane Flight, which for 1 blue mana is an enchantment aura at common, and it's an enchant creature. It says enchanted creature gets +1/+1 and has flying. This is an aggressive aura, to be sure. Kind of a mini one with the wind. This is definitely an aura more aggressive decks in the format will be playing. That said, like all auras, it can be incredibly swingy. If your opponent can't kill the creature you put this on, they probably lose, and if they can kill it, you probably lose, because the 2-for-1 is hard to overcome. Still, only costing 1 mana does make the 2-for-1 hurt a little bit less, and it also makes it easier to cast this in a window when your opponent has no mana up. Basically, though, if you're a mid-range or control deck, you should steer clear of this, but if you're interested in just winning the game incredibly quickly and don't have a problem going all in on how swingy this is, then you'll play it. I think because of its swingy nature and only being something that one very specific type of deck wants, and it's hard to say whether or not a blue deck that's aggressive will even exist in this format. All of that makes me hesitant to give it more than a D+, though I could certainly see it being a card that moves up to like C in a format where, you know, things are really aggressive. Next, we have one of my favorite cards in the set, Artificer's Assistant, which is for 1 blue mana, a 1/1 bird at common with flying, and whenever you cast a historic spell, you scry 1. It's It's like they designed this card with me in mind. If you don't know, I am a pretty avid bird watcher, and that's why my draft overlay features a few bird creatures, and this one might get added to it soon with this amazing art. Also, I'm very into evasive creatures, scrying, and synergy, and this does all of those things. That said, I'll be impartial in my review here. A 1-mana 1/1 flyer on its own isn't a great card in most formats, but luckily that's not all this does. Most decks will be able to get 5 or so historic permanents without even trying, so I think on average this is playable, though you don't want to play it if you have like 5 or less historic cards, but I think it's like a D if you do. It pushes all the way up to a C though in a deck with a lot of historic cards, because adding Scry 1 to like 6 or 7 spells you cast a game is a pretty significant upside. Now I just need to see about getting this card on my overlay. Next, we have Befuddle, which for 2 generic and a blue is a common instant that says target creature gets -4/-0 until end of turn, draw a card. Blue frequently gets these effects, sort of a blue combat trick, and they usually aren't very good. This is because you want a combat trick to actually help you take down an opponent's creature. This won't do that in most scenarios, although sometimes it will enable you to like triple block and kill a creature without losing anything, and that'll feel pretty good. It does come with a cantrip, which ups its value considerably, and there is a Spells Matter sub-theme in this set, especially in blue-red, so that helps it too. Still, I don't think you're going to be really excited about this still being in a pack, or thrilled to be putting it into your deck. I'm going to give it a D+. I think most of the time you don't play it. Next, we have Blink of an Eye, which for 1 generic and 1 blue is a common instant. It has Kicker for 1 generic and a blue, and it says return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. If this spell was kicked, draw a card. This is effectively a reprint of Into the Royal, which was a good card last time we saw it, and this is a nice use of the kicker mechanic. 2 mana bounce, any non-land permanent effects are always good and limited. They can just do a lot of different stuff. In most formats, they're like a C+. You can use them to break up combat tricks or your opponent trying to play an aura, and you can use them to save your creature or maybe abuse and enter the battlefield ability, or you can just use them to get a blocker or attacker out of your way. What makes this really powerful is the fact that if you pay 2 additional mana, it also draws you a card. If this card was just 4 mana, bounce target non-land permanent and draw a card, I'd be pretty happy about that and think of it as a good card already, but this has the additional flexibility of bouncing for only 2 mana in a pinch. This card's great and can be taken early, and you won't ever be cutting it from your blue decks. I think it's a B-. Next, we have Cloud Reader Sphinx, which for 4 generic and a blue is a 3/4 Sphinx at common. It has flying, and when it enters the battlefield, scry 2. I like this card a lot. Seriously, this is my kind of common. 5 mana for a 3/4 flyer isn't actually that far behind on rate, and probably is about close what you expect to pay for it. Maybe it's off by a little bit, but adding Scry 2 to that is great. People often underestimate just how good scrying is, especially in limited. If you can increase your card quality significantly, as Scry 2 does, it goes a long way to making sure that you keep drawing gas in the late game, while your opponent may not be able to make such guarantees. I really want to give this Sphinx a B-, but I'm going to reel myself in. I'm not going to want to first pick this, no matter how much I like it, and that means it's not a B-. Even if I do want to run a couple of them in basically every blue deck, it isn't game-breaking enough or impactful enough to be first pickable. It's just a nice value creature that can win the game in the air while also helping you draw better, and that means it's a C+. Next, we have Coldwater Snapper, which for 4 generic and a blue is a 4/5 turtle at common with hexproof. This is just a big dumb guy with hexproof, and an excellent place to put Arcane Flight. That may be the Jade Guardian one with the win combo of this format, so be ready for that. Even without Arcane Flight or other enhancements, this guy is fine. 6 mana for a 4/5 is a bit expensive, but you know he isn't going anywhere in most cases, and so that makes it a little less painful to pay so much for him because your opponent can't remove him, they can't bounce him, they can't really hurt you with that kind of tempo, so that extra mana investment doesn't hurt as much as it can for some 6 mana creatures. He is a pain for an aggressive deck to attack through for sure, and a decent enough attacker. That said, I think you cut him more than you play him, barring Arcane Flight shenanigans, and I'm going to give him a C-. Next, we have Curator's Ward, which for 2 generic and a blue is an enchant permanent. It says enchanted permanent has hexproof. When enchanted permanent leaves the battlefield, if it was historic, draw 2 cards. This card is interesting. I like auras that can help me out if my creature dies, instead of just getting me 2 for 1, and this can do that. First of all, it gives your creature hexproof, so it can't die to removal, and then if it dies in combat, you at least get to draw 2 cards. But you're still losing 2 permanents in the process, so you're not actually really, I mean, you're sort of negating the 2 for 1, but you're not getting ahead of it. Hexproof certainly makes a big, scary creature a serious problem too, but this is this aura is only good on creatures who are already good. It doesn't offer any stats boost to help the creature become better. It only offers the keyword ability Hexproof. Now, it can be put on, for example, your sagas to keep them from getting blown up, and because they're going to go to the graveyard eventually anyway, you get to draw 2 cards after Chapter 3, but it's still not that good there. You're still, losing 2 cards and drawing 2 cards. It's not great. I don't like this card overall. I think it's just a D. I think I'm not going to play it very often. There will be some rare cases where I do, and those cases will be when I have a big, scary, legendary bomb or 3, and then I would think about playing it, but I don't think you play it most of the time. Next, we have Deep Freeze, which for 2 generic and a blue is a common aura with Enchant Creature, and it says, Enchanted Creature has base power and toughness 0/4, has Defender, loses all other abilities, and is a blue wall in addition to its other colors and types. I really love the design space blue has been given lately, where it can just turn creatures into blank slates. Sure, this one makes the creature into a 0/4, which can actually be an obnoxious blocker, and I think the fact that it lets your opponent keep a relevant body on the battlefield keeps us from quite reaching premium status. But what it has that a lot of other enchantment-based removals don't have is that it turns off your opponent's static abilities and activated abilities on the creature because it just takes everything away from it. And so, Pacifism, for example, can't shut down an Anthem effect. It can't shut down an activated ability. Deep Freeze can, so it does some things better than Pacifism. It also costs 1 mana more. It's certainly worse than Pacifism, don't get me wrong. But there's some upside to what it does. It'll be especially useful in like a Skies deck with lots of flyers, because then you really don't care about this Defender on the ground. But it's not premium removal. It's quality removal. It's good removal. I'm going to give it a C+. You can't really call a spell that leaves your creature with a blocker in play premium, especially because it can block everything that has up to 3 power. But it is good. You'll play it in your blue deck, probably up to like 3 copies of it, especially if you have a lot of flyers. Next, we have Diligent Excavator, which for 1 generic and 1 blue is a 1/3 human artificer. And it says, whenever you cast a historic spell, target player puts the top 2 cards of their library into their graveyard. So there are a few cards that can help you build a mill deck in this format, and when combined with black or white, blue also likes to put cards in its own graveyard. So this could be a nice card in 2 different types of decks. On top of that, this has decent stats for its cost. As I keep saying, your average limited deck in this format will probably manage 5 or so historic things, and that's a decent number for a trigger. But your deck also has to either have more ways to mill cards from your opponent's deck, because just having this as your mill engine isn't going to be enough, or ways to do things with cards in your graveyard, and that stuff just won't always be true. I think she's basically unplayable in a lot of situations, basically an F, maybe a D-. I mean, a 2-mana 1/3 is a 2-mana 1/3, but when you can fulfill any of those aforementioned synergies, she gets a lot better and probably becomes a C+ or so. Next, we have Divination. 2 generic mana, 1 blue, sorcery, at common, draw 2 cards. This is a reprint. We've seen it and similar effects a lot, and we usually just refer to 3 mana, draw 2 cards as Divinations because of this old school card. Obviously enough, this card technically gives you a 2-for-1, and this format does have a deck that really cares about spells, blue-red, making it a little better. But 3 mana to draw 2 at sorcery speed isn't incredible. It isn't like this is Secrets of the Golden City, which we just saw, where in the late game it draws you a 3rd card, and that's what made Secrets of the Golden City so good. It could be this, or it could be even better. This just always draws you 2, and you can really only afford to have so many cards in your deck that don't impact the board at all. If this format is even remotely fast, a card like Divination is going to be a dangerous and perhaps impossible play on turn 3. It's still nice to play it in the late game to help you get ahead of your opponent in terms of cards, and again, the Spells Matter deck does prop this up at least a little bit. I know all that sounds like I hate this card, but I actually don't. It's the kind of card I like to play in a limited format, and I think a lot of blue decks will feel fine about running one. But if you're looking to cut something from your deck, this is probably going to be where you end up in a lot of cases, and I think that means it's a C-. Next, we have Homarid Explorer, which for 3 generic and 1 blue is a 3/3 Homarid Scout at common. And when it enters the battlefield, target player puts the top 4 cards of their library into their graveyard. A vanilla 4-mana 3/3 wouldn't be worth playing, and this is only a little more than that. Now, we just talked about how there's a mill deck potentially, and he could fit into that deck because he can mill your opponent's cards, and he can also mill your own if you're interested in getting value out of your own graveyard. So he has a home. But he doesn't do either of those things that well. I mean, he does it, he's fine at it, and you'll play him in those decks sometimes. But I think most of the time, you know, the mill deck's not going to come together and you're not going to be wanting to mill your opponent anyway. It's kind of a problem in this format. In a lot of formats, it's a problem when you can mill your opponent to try to win, but the format also has graveyard value cards. Those two things together can be really bad for a mill deck. And so I don't like this guy very much on the whole. I think he's a D+. I think he'll occasionally make his way into your deck and you'll feel pretty good about it when you have like a lot of graveyard synergies, or maybe you have like bunch of mill cards and suddenly he's pretty okay, but he's never going to be great. Next we have In Bolas's Clutches, which for 4 generic and 2 blue is a legendary enchantment aura at uncommon. It has enchant permanent and it says you control enchanted permanent and enchanted permanent is legendary. This is insane. So, you know, there was the big leak where we got to see a lot of the cards really early because they accidentally released the set notes a little early. And this is one of the cards there, and I just assumed it would be rare because mind control effects are so powerful. But it's not. It is not rare, and it happens to be a historic and legendary permanent, so it has some extra synergy. It's only uncommon, and I think it's just the best uncommon in the set. This is because mind control effects are insanely powerful. They're built in 2-for-1s. Think of it as a card that destroys your opponent's creature and creates a copy of that creature for you. That's essentially what it is. It is a little bit weaker than that because your opponent can obviously blow up the aura and then get their creature back, or any permanent, by the way. You can steal planeswalkers with this. And again, the additional legendary clause on this will sometimes even be relevant. I think this is a really good card. Again, the best uncommon. I think it's better than most of the rares in the format. It's like the Ravenous Chupacabra of this format, and I'm going to give it an A-. Next, we have Karn's Temporal Sundering, which for 4 generic and 2 blue is a legendary sorcery, the blue part of that cycle, at rare. And again, to cast a legendary sorcery, you need a legendary creature or planeswalker in play. And this one says, target player takes an extra turn after this one. Return up to 1 target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. Exile Karn's Temporal Sundering. This legendary sorcery is certainly worth the payoff. I would have thought this card was solid if it just let you take an extra turn for 6 mana. But adding the fact that it bounces a permanent to your opponent's hand makes it a lot better. If it just gave you the extra turn, in most cases you wouldn't really be able to make your board increase or get ahead of your opponent a whole lot more than theirs, since you have to dump 6 mana into this. But in this case, even if all you did with your turn is cast this, you're going to be making up some ground because it bounces something. This means it is good even if you're behind. It still has the setup that all legendary sorceries ask of you, but that's not a huge problem in this format. Still, that setup does keep me from wanting to give this like an A- or higher. I'm going to give it a B+, but that still means it's first pickable in the vast majority of situations. And again, if you first pick this, you should value legendary creatures a little bit more than you normally would. Next, we have Merfolk Trickster, which for 2 blue mana is a 2/2 Merfolk Wizard with Flash. When it enters the battlefield, tap target creature an opponent controls. It loses all abilities until end of turn. I like the design here a lot. It's another card that blanks a creature, sort of. It's a cool thing to see. This one doesn't quite blank it because it holds on to its stats, but it makes it lose keyword abilities, activated abilities, all abilities. So it sort of reminds me of Warkite Marauder. Obviously, it's not quite as good as that because it only does it once, but this card can be used incredibly flexibly. You can use it aggressively with your main goal just tapping down a blocker so you can do more damage on your turn. You can use it defensively to keep your opponent's best creature from attacking. You can use it to turn off a creature who is pumping other creatures. You know, there's a couple lords in this format, and turning that off can be a big burden for the opponent's board. And it's just a 2 mana 2/2 with Flash, which is already pretty good. Has a useful creature type in Wizard. All of that stuff, you know, all the different stuff it can do between tapping creatures, taking away creatures' abilities. I mean, you could kind of use it as a combat trick if your opponent attacks with a creature with first strike or something, you know, into your 2/2, and you take away its first strike and block it. You know, you can block it and kill it. So I think this is a really good card. I think it's going to be first pickable in some packs. It does ask you to play a lot of islands, but I think it's still a B-. Next, we have the Mirari Conjecture, which for 4 generic and 1 blue is a rare enchantment saga. Chapter 1 returns an instant card from your graveyard to your hand. Chapter 2 returns a sorcery card from your graveyard to your hand. And Chapter 3 copies all of your instant and sorcery spells for a single turn. I will start off by saying I like this card a lot. I'm always a fan of spells decks in limited formats, and this is going to be one of the best rare payoffs for it in this format. Immediately fetching you an instant from your graveyard, then getting a sorcery, and then doubling them, that's pretty good, especially if what you're getting back is removal. That said, this is definitely a build-around. You don't want this in your deck unless it fulfills some rather strict requirements. That is, not only a good number of instants and sorceries, but a relatively proportional mix of the two. If you're only getting one card back from your yard with this, it's not nearly as good. You want to be consistently getting 2 of them with this. So even if you're in a spells deck and you have like 10, if 8 of them are instants and 2 are sorceries, this might be a little risky. Because of all of that, this isn't really first pick material, at least not in pack 1. Let the spells deck come to you, and then you can take one of these and really get some good mileage out of it. I think this is a D in your typical limited deck, though even that might be generous, and it's like a B in a deck that is heavy on spells and does a good job of mixing both instants and sorceries. I'm really looking forward to that chapter 3 and just casting a kill spell and getting 2 copies of it. Like, that's going to feel great. So I like this card a lot, but I don't recommend first picking it. It's a good payoff if you are already getting there, basically, with a spells deck. Next, we have Naban, Dean of Iteration, who for 1 generic and 1 blue is a 2/1 legendary creature human wizard at rare, and he has a rather interesting text box that says, if a wizard entering the battlefield under your control causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. This is the kind of wizard payoff that is definitely a build-around, and not something you really play if you don't have wizards whose triggers he can duplicate. A 2-mana 2/1 is passable, and as a fail case, it could be worse, but it's something like a D-. If your deck gets loaded up with wizards who can benefit from this, he certainly improves. Imagine bouncing 2 creatures with Academy Journey Mage, or tapping down 2 creatures with Merfolk Trickster, and you'll see what I mean. And luckily, a ton of wizards have Enter the Battlefield abilities in this set, so it isn't that hard to end up with a wizard deck that has those. And keep in mind, it isn't only triggered abilities that come from your wizard, it's any trigger that happens from a wizard creature entering the battlefield. And there are additional triggers that aren't part of the actual wizard card, but that a creature entering the battlefield can cause, and this can give you a double trigger. So, like I said, though, in a deck with 0 wizards who can benefit from this effect, he's like a D-. You'll play him if you're desperate for a 2-drop. And in a deck where you have like 5 or more cards who can really benefit, he probably moves all the way up to a B-, because even if you only get 1 trigger twice, that's going to be some serious value. So he has a nice ceiling, but his floor is terrible. So again, not something you really want to first. Next up, we have Naru Meha, Master Wizard, who for 2 generic and 2 blue is a 3/3 legendary creature human wizard at Mythic with Flash. And it says, when Naru Meha, Master Wizard, enters the battlefield, copy target instant or sorcery spell you control. You may choose new targets for that copy. Oh, and other wizards you control get +1/+1. So this is another creature who's a wizard payoff, but it's good even in a deck with 0 wizards. First, a 4-mana 3/3 with Flash is kind of okay already, as Flash creatures can often double as removal spell. She can come in and block a 2/2, for example. Next, it lets you copy instants or sorceries you control. Generally, the most powerful thing to do there is to copy removal, but even something as innocuous as Opt is some pretty nice value. Then the fact that this is a Wizard Lord is historic, and legendary is just more icing on the cake. The floor here is probably something like a B-. And if your deck is wizard heavy, I think it goes all the way up to a B+, and maybe even an A-. Because his floor is so reasonable and ceiling so high, this is worth taking with the first pick in packs that don't have premium removal or bombs. So speaking of Opt, that's our next card. It's 1 blue mana for an instant at common. It says scry 1, then draw a card. So we've seen Opt very recently in Limited, and you know, it's fine. It's a card that's way better in Constructed than Limited. I don't want people to overrate this card just because it sees play in non-rotating formats like Modern right now. That said, Opt isn't bad in Limited. In some ways, it can make your deck more consistent, effectively making your deck only 39 cards. It gets a little bit of an additional boost in this format too, because there is a spell deck, which we didn't have in Ixalan when we saw it the first time. Cantrips are always great in decks that care about when you cast spells, and this is a good one. I'm just going to put this where I had it in Ixalan, which is about a C. You can cut it from your deck without being too disappointed, and you can run it and have about the same feeling in most cases. Next, we have Precognition Field, which for 3 generic and 1 blue mana is an enchantment at rare. It says you may look at the top card of your library. You can do that at any time. And you can cast the top card of your library if it's an instant or sorcery card, and it has an activated ability. For 3 generic mana, you can exile the top card of your library. This is most definitely a build-around. Sure, if your deck has 0 instants and sorceries in it, it gives you a little bit of information and can help you improve your draw, so it isn't completely useless in a deck that doesn't have spells, but you're going to want to have a lot of spells to really make this worth it. If you can make it so the top card of your library is essentially in your hand a significant portion of the time, and that's what this does if it's an instant or sorcery, you're going to generate some serious card advantage. Something really cool to do with this is to have an instant on top of your library, no cards in your hand, and to cast that instant off the top of your library as a surprise for your opponent. Now, granted, they know you have Precognition Field in play, but that's still going to feel pretty good. Basically, though, I think this is a D in a deck with like the normal number of instants and sorceries, probably 4 or 5, and a B- on a deck that really gets there with like, 8 to 10 of them. It's going to be really fun in a deck with a lot of them, and in one without very many of them, it's not going to really do very much. Next, we have Relic Runner, which for 1 generic and 1 blue is a 2/1 human rogue at common, and it can't be blocked if you've cast a historic spell this turn. 2-mana 2/1s aren't great. They're the kind of subpar 2-drop you play where you're desperate. But this comes with some upside. Since most decks will have a few historic cards in them, and this has decent stats, I think it's something like a D+ in your typical deck in the format. Now, if your deck can make her unblockable a significant portion of the time, then she gets better, but still isn't anything incredible, and she gets a C. Next, we have Rescue, which for 1 blue mana returns a permanent you control to its owner's hand. It's an instant, and it's common. This card isn't something you're going to want to play in most cases. Sure, it can save your creature from removal, but you have to be ready to cast it at just the right time for that to matter. I'm going to give it an F in most limited decks in this format. You'll only play this in a deck where you have lots of enter the battlefield abilities too, where its uses extend beyond saving a creature from removal. It still isn't going to be great even in those decks though. It's probably like a C-. So basically it's the kind of card you'll run if you're short on playables or have an insane number of enter the battlefield triggers. Next, we have Sage of Lot Nam, which is a reprint, 1 generic and 1 blue for a 1/2 human artificer at uncommon. You can tap it and sacrifice an artifact to draw a card. This is obviously another build around. If your deck doesn't have very many artifacts, you just can't play this. It's basically an F. There are a decent number of artifacts in this set though, and once you can cash them in for cards, this gets interesting. But still, the artifact stuff going on in this set isn't so good that it is easy to find artifacts worth sacrificing. I mean, it isn't like we're making treasure tokens here. I think this is just a build around C. This set just isn't the ideal place for it. There are a lot of artifacts, but there aren't a lot of them that you really feel good about sacrificing. Next, we have Sentinel of the Pearl Trident, which for 4 generic and 1 blue is a merfolk soldier at uncommon with flash, and when it enters the battlefield, you may exile target historic permanent you control. If you do, return that card to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. I don't think I mentioned earlier when we counted her historic for the first time, but just to remind you, artifacts, legendaries, and sagas are historic for those of you who are just listening to this. This is a solid card. Sure, a 5-mana 3/3 with flash isn't great, but the fact that it can exile historic permanent you control is some nice upside. It can do a number of things when it does that. Save your creature from removal or get an aura-based removal spell off of it, abuse an enter the battlefield trigger, or reset one of your sagas so you get more value out of it. That said, if your deck doesn't have a significant number of historical permanents in it, you should steer clear, as this is something like a D if you just have a few. I feel like you need around 7 or more historical permanents to really feel like this is worth running, and a significant number of them should have Into the Battlefield triggers or be sagas. When you do that, it's probably a C+. Next, I have Slinvoda, the Rising Deep, which for 6 generic and 2 blue is an 8/8 legendary creature Leviathan at uncommon. He has Kicker for 1 generic and a blue, and when he enters the battlefield, if it was kicked, it returns all creatures to their owner's hands, except for merfolk krakens, leviathans, octopi, and serpents. This guy costs a ton of mana. An 8-mana 8/8 usually isn't something you're excited to play. I mean, how often did Ancient Bronodon make the cut? This does come with some extra and very powerful upside. If you happen to have 10 mana laying around, it bounces a bunch of non-aquatic creature types. The 10 mana version of this is interesting, but it's still 10 mana. I think this guy is too clunky and expensive to be worth it in your average limited deck, but I will say that a deck that is really good at ramping, this is going to be a nice thing to play at the top of your curve, but I'm going to give it a D+ as a reflection of the fact that he won't fit into your average deck in this format. Next, we have Syncopate, another reprint, which is an instant at common, and it costs X and a blue. It says counter target spell unless its controller pays X. If that spell is countered this way, exile it instead of putting it into its owner's graveyard. I'm not usually too big of a fan of counter spells, but X counter spells are a different animal. This is because they are much more flexible than most other counterspells that let your opponent avoid them if they have the mana to pay a cost. This is because you can just use this whenever it comes in handy for you. Sometimes casting it for 2 will be plenty, and sometimes in the late game you'll just have a table full of mana and can counter anything. All that said, this still isn't a great card or a premium common or anything, but I do think it's playable, and that's more than I can say about a lot of counter spells. I think it's a solid C. Next, we have Tempest Djinn, which for 3 blue mana is a 0/4 Djinn at rare with flying, and it gets +1/+0 for each basic island you control. Every color in this set has a powerful creature with a mana cost that really pushes you towards wanting to play a monocolor deck, and that's what Tempest Djinn is, and it makes you want to do it even more because it demands that you have basic islands in play to pump him. For 3 blue mana, you get what is probably a 3/4 flyer and will continue to grow throughout the game, and that's a great deal. Problem is, in like 99% of drafts, going monocolor is a bad idea because your card quality will be so much lower. Your deck needs like 11 or 12 islands for this to be worth playing, and ideally, even more than that, like 16 or 17. The good news is, as long as you are heavy blue, it isn't the end of the world to play this later in the game, as a large flyer with 4 toughness is relevant no matter what stage of the game it is. Still, the mana requirements and deck building requirements are hefty, and because of that, I don't think I want to start my draft with this in most cases. I'd rather be mostly blue and get this, than get this and try to force blue and end up with a subpar deck. I'm going to give it a C+, with the obvious caveat that it's pretty much an A in a mono blue deck. Next, we have Tetsuko Umezawa, Fugitive, which for 1 generic and 1 blue is a 1/3 legendary creature, human rogue at uncommon, and it says creatures you control with power or toughness 1 or less can't be blocked. This card has a fun design. At worst, it is a 1 mana 1/3 that is unblockable, that triggers any cards that care about legendary or historic stuff. That's not a bad deal at all, probably something like a C. But the more creatures in your deck with 1 toughness or 1 power, the more interesting this gets, as it can enable you to assemble an army of unblockable creatures. I don't think one should really try forcing this and picking up creatures with 1 power or 1 toughness if they end up with Tetsuko, especially because Tetsuko is fragile, and if you don't have him in play, some of those creatures are going to be bad. But most limited decks are going to end up with other creatures with those stats, and for example, if you're making Saplings, that's going to feel pretty good, and their value should go up if you have Tetsuko in your deck. I think he is a C+. Next, we have Time of Ice, which for 3 generic and a blue is an enchantment saga at uncommon. Chapter 1 and 2 do the same thing, and that is tapping down a creature an opponent controls. It doesn't untap during its controller's untap step for as long as you control Time of Ice. Chapter 3 says return all tapped creatures to their owner's hand. These sort of tap-down effects are generally at their best in more aggressive decks. This is because if you're the one who's attacking, you make your opponent miss 2 blocks. You can use it to slow down your opponent's attackers, but they're only going to miss 1 attack phase, so that's not nearly as good. This lets you tap things down a couple times, and then it will bounce all tapped creatures. Because of when sagas get counters added to them, your creatures won't ever be untapped for that, so you'll only ever be bouncing your opponent's creatures. This means you'll generally get to bounce 2 things, and it also means your opponent has to play around that annoying effect, so all in all, this card can really help you get ahead in a race. In some cases, maybe you'd rather just play a 4-drop creature, but allowing your 2s and 3s to get through while really tormenting your opponent with the big bounce effect isn't a bad thing for an aggressive deck to do either. While it's certainly better to use aggressively, it's still alright to use defensively, and overall I think this card's really good, and it's a first pickable one. I'm going to give it a B-. Next, we have Tolarian Scholar, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 2/3 human wizard at common, and that's it. It's another vanilla creature. You only play this if things go wrong. This one at least has the upside of having a relevant creature type for the format, so if your deck has like 10 cards that want you to have wizards, it gets a little better, but still, you don't usually play this. It's just a pretty classic D+. Next, we have Unwind, which for 2 generic and a blue is a common instant that says counter target non-creature spell. Untap up to 3 lands. This is a fun homage to Rewind, basically amounting to a free counter spell since it untaps your lands after you play it. Unlike Rewind, though, it can only hit non-creature spells, and obviously that limitation makes it something of a liability to put into your main board. I'm not saying you should never put it there. I'm saying it's like a D+ there, though, if you have to play it there, meaning you don't really want to end up with it in your deck. Like all counter spells, it has the problem that you just can't control what your opponent will do. If you leave 3 mana up for this thing and your opponent plays a creature spell, that's a huge tempo hit for you. For that reason, it is usually going to be better to just build your board when you can and then use Unwind on a turn when you can't do anything else. But since this can only hit non-creatures, it has a bit of a problem. Limited decks are basically always predominantly creatures, and you'll play some people where you see maybe 2 targets for this the whole game, and if your mana wasn't up at the right time, well, may as well not have this card. For all these reasons, I don't want to play this main board if I can help it, though if my opponent has some powerful non-creature bombs in their decks, or a deck loaded with removal, I will definitely side this in and feel pretty good about it. I think it's a C+ out of your sideboard. Next is Vodalian Arcanist, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 1/3 Merfolk Wizard at common. It can tap to add colorless mana to your mana pool, but you can only cast an instant or sorcery spell with that mana. This is a nice payoff for the Spells Matter deck. It has okay stats for its cost too, which means you don't have to give up a lot for it. Most blue limited decks will have some instants and sorcery, so it's not going to be unplayable in your average blue deck, but it's not going to be great either. I think it's like a D+ in a blue deck that doesn't have a lot of instants and sorceries. Any limited deck that manages to have like 7+ instants and sorceries will be getting some good value out of this, though. I think it's like a C+ there. Next, we have Weight of Memory, which for 3 generic and 2 blue is an uncommon sorcery that says draw 3 cards. Target player puts the top 3 cards of their library into their graveyard. This is another card that can do double duty. You can use it to mill your opponent or yourself, and on top of that, it draws you 3 cards. 5 mana sorcery speed things can be pretty scary to cast in some situations, and casting this on turn 5 isn't always going to be the best thing, since chances are good your opponent will be pressuring you some, and they will add to the board while you aren't as you cast this. However, this does synergize well with several different color pairs. Blue-red is interested in instants and sorceries, and blue-white and black-blue are interested in the graveyard, and it is the kind of card that can win you the game when you and your opponent are at parity late. It's a strong draw spell with some extra value, and I'm going to give it a C+. Next, we have Wizard's Retort, which for 1 generic and 2 blue is an uncommon instant, and it says this spell costs 1 less to cast if you control a wizard, and it says counter target spell. So in a deck without many wizards in it, this is Cancel, a card that is usually about a D in most limited formats. Counter spells, again, are problematic and limited because you have to have the mana up at the proper time for the card to actually do something, and sometimes you just aren't able to do that. The cheaper a counterspell is, the easier it is to leave that mana up, and if you are a wizard-heavy deck, this is effectively Counterspell, a card that is significantly better than Cancel. And yes, 1 mana makes that much difference when it comes to counter magic. Basically, this is a D in a deck low on wizards, and a C+ in a deck that has a good number of them. Next, we have Zahid, Djinn of the Lamp, which for 4 generic and 2 blue is a legendary creature Djinn at rare, and he says, you may pay 3 generic into blue and tap an untapped artifact you control rather than pay this spell's mana cost. And he has flying, and he's a 5/6. I like him a lot. His floor is being a 6 mana 5/6 flyer, basically Mahamati Djinn, and that is something that would be like a B- in limited. He comes with the additional upside of being able to be cast for only 4 mana if you have enough artifacts in your deck. A 4 mana 5/6 flyer can end the game in a hurry. Your opponent really has to have removal for that early of an evasive threat. So he has a high floor and a high ceiling, and I think all that amounts to him being a good first pick. He'll be good even if you have 0 artifacts, and great if you have some. I'm going to give him a B+. So that's the last blue card in Dominaria. Tomorrow I'll return to talk about all the black cards in the set. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so others can enjoy it too. Don't forget to subscribe to see the rest of the limited review. Thanks for watching.